Hey everybody, it's Bust, continuing our discussion of the Legends of Runeterra 2024 standard rotation. And we're about halfway through the series. If you're interested in the Runeterran champions or Bandle City or Demacia or Bilgewater or Ionia or Freylord, we've covered off on those. Today we'll be talking about Noxus and P&Z. Before we dive in, I still recommend that you come out and read this article. It's on the main Play Runeterra site, the Rotation 2024 preview by I Am Walrus. It goes in depth into a lot of the reasoning behind some of the changes that they've made, why some things came in, why some things go out, and why your favorite champion is no longer in the game. But relevant to today's discussion is the idea of linear things. This would just be like the lurk mechanic, where you basically just put all of the lurk cards in your deck and go forward. They all interact with each other because they share the lurk mechanic. The other kind of odd thing out of this to me is the champion that needs improvement, which will be Darius today. Darius to me did not need improvement in terms of power level, but I guess he is kind of a vanilla-ish kind of champion. So we can come back to that in a bit. But nonetheless, the most baffling thing to me about what they are doing here with Noxus kind of ties into the linear strategies, but it also ties into the stuff of just kind of determining what factions are good at. And there's kind of a two-pronged approach to that here. The big change that it looks like coming to Noxus is the removal of the linear strategy and reputation, which is just basically if your unit has 5 or more attack, you get some kind of bonus. And so we see a lot of this coming out. There is LeBlanc, the Trifarian Hopeful, and the Reckless Trifarian as activators, things like the Trifarian Training Pits as payoff for it, and then our fan favorite and the Incisive Tactician is a card that gets some of the payoff with reputation going. And I'm kind of up in the air as this being a thing to remove. Like on one hand, it's just not that interesting, right? What's your thing? What's your stick? How do I build my deck? You just put big units in it, right? It's not that compelling of a build around type thing. But if you're a beginner, if you're new to the game, it is a very kind of easy to understand concept to really push forth some of the mechanics. And so as I mentioned in some of our previous videos, the things that I do like about the lurk mechanic is that as you jump into a complex game like Legends of Runeterra, there's just so much stuff to think about. There's so many things to know, things to think about in terms of the interactivity that can happen, that it can be pretty overwhelming. And it's kind of nice if you're playing a deck like Lurk, since you don't have to think about nearly as much. You don't have to think about what if I do X, Y, Z in relevance to the abilities. I just attack and my units get bigger, right? And so there's a lot of those same kind of tones that come out of the reputation mechanic, in the sense that you don't have to do a lot of figuring out if you're about to get reputation going. You just see that my unit has 5 attack, something cool is about to happen, right? Or maybe I can play some way to grow a unit to have 5 attack. I can use my Elixir of Wrath on a small unit, make it a big unit. Now it activates this ability. And so I get why you may not want it within the game. It's not super flavorful. It's not that compelling. Once you've played the game a little bit, you've kind of very easily figured it out. But they're sending very mixed signals in terms of what's actually happening with this and why they're actually ripping it out. And so there are this big handful of cards amongst the Noxus units that are on the way out that would signal that this is one of the linear mechanics that's on the on the rise, that's getting pulled from the game. But why do we come out here and still see things like Captive Yeti coming back in, or Thorn of the Rose coming back in, or if we go down to the Shuriman counterparts that shared the reputation cards, we have Sivir in here and Callous Bone Crusher in here. And so it's very strange to me as to whether or not this is actually like a linear pull, right? If they're just trying to gut reputation out of the game, or if these are kind of like power level concerns. But who's ever said that Trifarian Hopeful is too powerful, or Trifarian Training Pits is too powerful? And so, from a gameplay perspective, I don't really care. I don't feel like it's a huge net negative for this kind of thing to be happening, but it's just very strange, these card selections that were made. And that's kind of like the running theme with how I feel about a lot of the Noxus changes. They don't seem like too bad. They're not pulling a bunch of good cards. They're not taking the great stuff out of the kit. It just seems weird, the shit that they're doing, right? And so the same thing for me is like the big thing I always harp on in these is faction identity. What really defines what your faction is able to do? And within Noxus, it's a very combat-heavy, fighty style of thing. All of the units are trying to get in the middle and punch each other and fight and battle in the most aggressive fashion possible. And so then when you start talking about combat tricks, they typically give bonus attack, like Brother's Bond and Elixir of Wrath that are coming out, and not so much things like Sharpened Resolve, which gives both attack and health. And so our friend Thorned Blade, right? This is a very Noxon-style combat trick in that it works towards that 5-attack batter's theme, and it's all geared towards the attack. Like, these are very Noxon-style things that come out. Well, Sharpened Resolve, not so much. And so the same thing applies to these removal spells, right? What does Noxon removal tend to look like? It's the strike cards and the fight cards. And so Whirling Death was always a very straightforward and Noxon feeling kind of thing. You just have an ally strike another ally if it's in the middle of battle. That makes a lot of sense. And so to me, like, taking Whirling Death out, maybe it's a power level concern, but that's where the Noxon removal should be. And I think things like Disintegrate, while are kind of on flavor, aren't really where that Noxus stuff tends to live. To me, it's kind of okay having Disintegrate be a very Annie-centric style of Noxus thing, but it doesn't really fit the faction as a whole. The same thing can kind of be said about Lord Broadmane to me. We've seen some of these, my units hurt, let's, finish off the blow kind of abilities, but the things like this never really felt too Noxon to me. And so it feels odd to see those go. And then especially as we look at what's coming back in, seeing things like Noxon Guillotine return to the game. Like, this just does not feel particularly Noxon to me outside of the name. And so maybe that's what it is. Maybe the unit being weakened is the thing that you need to focus in on, but it just feels like they're blurring the lines of what Noxus should be doing, and they're kind of going back in time and picking up some of those older style of mechanics. And so that's very weird to me. But in terms of the other champions, Riven is one that probably needs to go. I think Riven is a fantastic champion in a world that plays fair, right? I think there's just an absolute ton of decks that really benefit from having Riven's abilities. And you can just go on and on and on. It can be a deck looking to discard cards, right? So you reforge, get a card in your hand and discard it. It can be decks looking to use Augment, and so you play a created card. It can be decks looking to play spells. It can be decks looking to target units. It can be putting Overwhelm onto a big dragon. It can be putting Quick Attack onto challengers. There's just like so many interesting things that Riven can do. And it's very fun and interesting when it's done in a fair way. Now, the unfortunate part with Riven is she does tend to land in a bunch of like Fizz-centric OTK style of decks, and I feel like that's ultimately why she's probably getting the axe out here, but I really wish that there was some kind of divine space to where she could stick around because the Reforge mechanic is so good. Still speaking to Reforge, though, it is weird as we see, some of the champions get lifted and all of their cards come out. That is not happening with Riven. And so the only Reforge card coming out is going to be the Runeweaver. And so there's still 2 or 3 Reforges hanging out and about. They just won't be out here with Riven herself. And so that does, I guess, to me, generate some odd situations to where you just have like the last breath unit on board. It dies enough to get the 3 fragments. You use the fragments and generate the sword, but Riven's nowhere to be seen. Like, fine, I guess. But it was kind of odd to me that the entirety of the kit was not pulled out. Last but not least in the champions is Darius. Darius is a very surprising pull to me. I mean, I guess some of the idea here is just pulling some of the overwhelm aspects out of Noxus, but Darius just seemed like a very straightforward style of champion that's a good one for newer players to kind of latch onto. And so I don't feel like every card has to be designed towards the most competitive crowd. It is good to have introductory cards within the set of standard, and that's what Darius always felt like to me. He's a nice kind of flagship champion for what Noxus is about. He has stuff that cares about dealing damage to your opponent. He flips to Decimate, which deals damage to your opponent, and then he goes big when the opposing Nexus is at half health, and just really drives home the big, like, punchy force of Noxus. And so I hope that at least Darius coming out is kind of a hint of Darius 2.0 coming forward, because it doesn't make sense to me to remove that flagship champion out of Noxus. Otherwise, some of these cards to me are agreeable, some are not, some it's just very strange. And so some of these, seem like they should be going. As we get more cards in the game, we can get rid of some of these things that aren't really Noxus centric. And so things like Legion Drummer probably doesn't belong in Noxus. Things like oh, I had one more down here that didn't feel very Noxan at home, but I'm glad to see cards like that go. Out of the kind of remaining cards, the only thing that really struck me as odd was the Ionian Hookmaster, and so this is the only weapon master that's coming out of the game. And it's just like why, why did you pick this one? And so I'm not entirely certain how things work across the board. I'm pretty certain that if you play Bandle City Mayor, Ionian Hookmaster will just no longer be in the thing. It should only be hitting the cards within the standard format, right? And so that will be a hit there. But this is the one that I had to go back and scroll through. I know that going through Demacia and going through Freylord, I would have made immediate notice if Combat Cook was no longer going to be in the game. So I was pretty certain that this is the first Weapon Master we've seen so far. But it's just strange that this is the one that they took out and no others, right? I get that this kind of generation ability, maybe it fits within P&Z or something, so you leave in the Attune unit and get rid of some of the other ones, but just pulling out one was kind of weird. Otherwise, as far as the cards coming back in, this was a bit of a disappointment to me. I'm just not a huge fan of the Battle Scars mechanic, and I guess that's what you get when you look to bring Braum back, is you bring back some of the Scarground stuff, and then you get to revive Vladimir from the Lands of Eternal in his reworked kit. Fine. I don't feel like any Vladimir deck ever really cares about the Battle Scars theme. And so he's just always played as a high value unit, right? Just having this come into play, deal damage ability on a reasonably statted guy. That's what Vladimir is. But he's coming back I guess he's coming back from the depths for some reason, but I just don't like the Battle Scars mechanic. And so the likes of Crimson Bloodletter, Crimson Acolyte, those style of cards just don't really do it for me. And I would have preferred that those just stay gone. Otherwise, we see things like Blade's Edge come in. This is not a very Noxan-centric removal spell. Not super excited to see it come back. And then I'm not really certain how I feel about Shunpo, right? To a degree, Noxus is supposed to be one of the rallying factions, but it just feels like it's always a super problematic card. And so I believe it was pulled out of standard last time because it wasn't super on theme and it was problematic. Now it's coming right back, and so I'm glad. I'm always happy to play Shunpo in my Noxus decks, but it's a strange one to see coming back in. And so, after Noxus, we do have P&Z. First one on the list, Seraphine. Glad to see that one go. It's just the problems that you have within the card design and my thoughts on Seraphine. I didn't harp on it on Karma. Is if you look at a game like Hearthstone, they've really kind of figured out the problem with these things, and that when you double something, it's bad, right? It just opens up so many opportunities to do obnoxious stuff that doubling things tends to be bad, but making something do one more tends to be in the place of safety. And so if you look at something that triggers a death rattle, triggering it twice is scary. That gets you into the place of doing multiplicative things, but if it does it one more time, it's not that bad, or it can only double it once per turn. And so I think that was probably the real pain points behind Karma and behind Seraphine, is that they weren't reined in, and it was just complete nonsense, doubling on top of doubling on top of doubling. And so, in my opinion, Seraphine on her own was strong enough, just a 1/4 for 2 that creates a card on summon. And then the doubling stuff was just obnoxious. And so I'm glad to see her go. That's completely fine to me. Otherwise, the only things that I can really call out with P&Z is they are getting rid of some of just the nonsense stuff. It feels like there were a lot of just kind of one-of themes within P&Z that weren't super fleshed out. and those are starting to go. And so things like Pursuit of Perfection, right? This is not a fully fleshed out kind of card. This is just, a one of Nito thing that appeared in Foundations. And while that was kind of cool for a little bit, it's not something that should probably live in Standard forever. The other thing happening here is it does look like they're starting to pull the elusives out of P&Z, and I'm fine with that as well. Again, I think cards like Acorn are very interesting if elusives aren't just out here to the max, right? And so to me, the stuff that was interesting with Acorn would have been, say, Champion Strength. And so you were using Acorn in the early game to establish a cheaper champion strength so that you could play it on turn 5 or turn 6 instead of turn 8 or so. And as long as that was all you were doing, if that was your 1 point of cost reduction and your 1 point of elusives, then that's a fairly fair kind of thing. But once you got into that space of using Acorn along with Daring Poros and Timos, and then more cost reduction with Janna, and you were able to champion strength your opponent out of the game on turn 4 or turn 5, that's where things started to get a little bit obnoxious. And so I think this is kind of a good move. Like, I understand that Acorn is more towards the overtuned spectrum, and so it's probably fine to get rid of him in general, but I do like seeing these rando elusives just chucked out of the game. And so Acorn's in here, Pharaoh's Sky Cruiser is in the mix, Submersible is in the mix as well. And so again, like, I think the elusive is still a fine ability to have around, but it's something that you want in a kind of limited fashion. Otherwise, the tech kit is going. Kind of good riddance. I was never a huge fan. Maybe it's because I just didn't play a ton of it. But with the Heimerdinger kit coming out, the Adaptron goes, the Hex Tech Handler goes, and these tech-based things are gone as well. To me, it was kind of super high-rolly in terms of if you hit your Hex Tech Handler early, then you tended to just overrun a bunch of games, and without it, it was kind of problematic for some of those decks. And so some of that stuff I'm glad to see go. And then otherwise, it doesn't feel like there's too much homogenous stuff within here, and it just feels like we're just getting rid of random stuff like Hex Tech Anomaly, which is fine, and then getting rid of stuff that is probably below curve in terms of power level. And so I feel like the P&Z cuts are fine. If you were a Seraphine enjoyer, you're probably a little bit sad about this, but otherwise there's no card within here that I look at and say, oh wow, you're taking away the heart of P&Z, right? If they'd cut out Mystic Shot or something, maybe that would be questionable, but it's not like looking at Noxus and seeing Whirling Death come out. In terms of the cards coming back in, Vi will be making an appearance. I was always very surprised Vi wasn't in Standard when Arcane was running around. I can't remember how the timing on that worked. Maybe Vi was in when Arcane came out, and then they took her out the next year, and now they're bringing her back. Maybe Arcane will have season 2 in the upcoming days. And so Vi is always an interesting champion. I think my problem with Vi is she doesn't thematically feel like she does P&Z type stuff. If you took Vi and just directly put her into Demacia, it would look like exactly what I would expect a Demacian champion to look like, right? It's got tough, it's got challenger, it has some kind of growing component, but that growing stat component takes a little bit of work, right? That's the kind of thing that I would suspect Vi looks like. It's just always strange to me seeing her in P&Z, which tends to be the kind of, brainy, scientific type folks doing sciencey stuff and not really being out here just punching people. And so I get that lore wise she probably belongs in P&Z, but thematically she doesn't really feel like a fit. And so I think that if you're out here in the place of reworking champions, then go rework Vi before you rework Darius. That's what would make sense to me. But nonetheless, as far as these other cards coming in, nothing too crazy happening within this stuff. There's no card I look at and say, oh wow, this is something that I'm super excited to play with, except for the likes of Ballistic Bot. I don't think Ballistic Bot would have made its way back into Standard, but there was something that happened at the Invitational, right? I know the Invitational happened. I'm not certain if they ever posted the content for it or what was actually happening with that. But my understanding was that Boulevard said, he did something and won something and made an event happen, and he got to take Mage Seeker Jr. out of Standard. Some other person, I don't remember who, got to bring back a card in Ballistic Bot. And I'm not quite certain how I feel about that, in the sense that Ballistic Bot was in Standard. It was nerfed down to a 0-3, and then it was shipped to Eternal, where it was reverted back to a 1-3. Now we're kicking it back to Standard, as I assume, as a 1-3, which we've already determined to be overtuned, and now we're just going to have to deal with it. And so I'm not certain how I feel about that. Like, I get the reason that it's here. I'm just not really keen on the execution. It's, again, like a card very much like Riven, in the sense that it supports a lot of themes, which is interesting, but it tends to just be this really like non-interactive OTK type of element, to where it does like 4 points of burn and then you hit it with an overwhelm and kill your opponent. And so it's very odd in that kind of sense to me. Otherwise, nothing too crazy in terms of what's coming back in. I look at a lot of these cards and just say, these cards are bad, right? These cards are trash. It's like, I guess every card in the world can't be a good card. There is a little bit of the 2-cost cards matter things with like the Patrol Wardens running around, but I don't know. I don't know whoever asked for Defective Swap Bot to come back, but I guess this is going to come into Standard and sit on the sidelines forever. Congratulations, my friend. And so, good stuff. That's Noxus and P&Z. I believe in our next video, there's 3 factions left, so we'll probably cover all of them within that singular video. I believe it's going to be Targon and Shadow Isles and one more, just the factions nobody cares about. And so we should have saved Ionia for that one, right? We should have just done Ionia, Targon, and Shadow Isles together and just said, nobody cares about any of these cards. And we could have got it done real quick. But nonetheless, good stuff. I had fun with that. I hope you did too, because that is going to do it for us today. So if everyone enjoyed the video, hopefully maybe learned a thing or two along the way. You had a good time watching. This is Bustin' Me. Thank you for being here.